Two and a Half Admins, episode 202. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, we have to talk about USB-C and fluff and dust and pocket lint and all the people who wrote into us to say that when Harold wrote in about having USB-C problems, that was almost certainly the cause. Now, I didn't mention it at the time because I assumed that Harold was smart enough to have checked that first.
We probably shouldn't have made that assumption. I didn't mention it at the time because I haven't found USB-C to be any more prone to collect pocket lint than the micro USB used to be. Matter of fact, the only time I've had to clean out a USB port, it was in the micro USB days. With that said, I don't necessarily know if USB-C is worse for that than micro USB because by the time my phones had USB-C, they also had Qi wireless charging. So I'm very rarely actually plugging a USB-C port into a phone. Now my tablet, sure, all the time. But a phone? No, not really since the micro USB days.
All my devices are wired and connected with USB-C. And yeah, it wouldn't have occurred to me immediately that's what the problem was. Maybe that was also just the way the description of the port not working was more that it didn't say, that the internal part had broken off or something, just that it wouldn't charge or wouldn't stay connected. And other stuff being jammed in there is a very likely cause of that, and not one I would have considered because I've just never had that happen to me with like Jim was saying, the micro USB or USB-C. And so it's not something I would have thought of, but that might have more to do with the fact that my phone's usually in a holster, not in my pocket. And my phone has a little flap that protects the USB-C port from getting cruft in it. It kind of goes back to, if anybody who's ever been, a sysadmin or IT person, the first thing you check is it actually plugged into the wall? And it turns out that there's a reason that's kind of a meme, is because so often that is the problem. And in this case, like if the jack won't plug in, it's like, well, maybe get a magnifying glass or something, look in there and see, is there something else stuck in there? Like some lint or another piece of metal. Or I had one time with a USB-A port on like the front panel of my computer where I yanked the USB cable for the microphone out and the little plastic like tongue that all the pins are on that's part of the port came off in the cable. Huh. And there were just like 4 pins sitting out of the front of my computer now. And it turned out the next time I plugged it back in and it worked, and it wasn't until much later that I noticed, like, why does that USB port look weird? It's like, oh, the tongue broke off in my cable, and it's been like that for a while, and I've just been plugging it, and it's been working anyway.
Before we get done with this, we should mention the proper way to get the fluff and lint and whatnot out of a USB-C port. It can be surprisingly difficult to clean that stuff out because by the time you notice it, because you've been having a problem with charging, it has been packed down to the consistency of concrete in that port. And there are delicate electronics in there that you don't want to destroy, so you need to be careful. I do not advise going and digging around in there with, a sewing needle or a pocket knife or anything metallic. What I would recommend is if you have nothing else, maybe try a toothpick. But better yet, if you work on little electronics all the time and you actually have, like a laptop repair kit with a proper plastic spudger, that's what you really want is, kind of a medium hardness plastic with a fine edge or point that you can kind of scoop that stuff out with.
Well, anyway, thank you everyone for writing in, but you can stop now, please. Let's do some news then. Microsoft ends Project Natick underwater data center experiment despite success.
This one made me a little bit sad. I reported on Project Natick when it was new, back when I was working at Ars Technica. So what Project Natick was essentially an experiment in underwater data centers. Microsoft would take, what amounts to a tractor-trailer cab, but watertight, and they would pack it full of servers, pump it full of, inert nitrogen gas, and then drop it down to the seabed, give it power and network, and, that would operate as a data center without a human touching it for several years. And the experiment was really quite successful. They discovered that they had far fewer equipment failures. They had greater uptime. You save a ton of money in cooling that you don't need because it's submersed underwater and the ocean is your heat sink. You're also not consuming tons of fresh water, again, to provide the cooling that you don't have to provide because you're sitting underwater using the entire ocean as a heat sink. It's not clear why Microsoft actually discontinued the project, but they were very clear that they're not building any more of them going forward. They were also very clear that they considered a success and that they learned valuable lessons that they're now going to apply to other types of data center elsewhere, which I'm glad that they learned things, and I'm glad that, we can benefit from that elsewhere, but I'm still a little sad to see the underwater data centers go, because I think they were a great idea, and there are some other things that model offered that you can't necessarily just take a lesson and put it in a traditional above ground data center. Sure, you can pump it full of nitrogen and not let humans walk around in it, but one of the neat things about Project Natick is so much of human civilization is centered around oceanfront property, right? And you can sink these little underwater data centers about a mile offshore, very near, a super populous, very expensive real estate town, get incredibly low latency because of the close geographic distance without taking up any real estate. And I think this is extremely important moving forward. And I'm glad that some other companies are moving forward with the underwater data centers, even as Microsoft is backing out.
Well, yeah, especially like we talked about a couple of weeks ago with the whole AI boom, meaning they need huge amounts of stuff that requires massive cooling. It seems like getting basically free cooling from the ocean has some advantages, although if you do this at a certain scale, you might actually affect the temperature of the ocean, and that would be bad.
Do we really want to mix AI and the horrors of the deep, Alan?
Probably not. And just for reference, it turns out the ones Microsoft deployed in Scotland were 120 miles off the coast, which seems kind of far.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was technically for jurisdictional reasons or if it was just the best place to do it. You don't want to be far enough away that tides aren't affecting the temperatures in the overall parts of the data center. And it might have just been that was where there was a nice shallow flat spot or whatever. But it is interesting. But the part I wanted to talk about really was the lower failure rate. So in this 40-foot tube, they packed 12 racks of servers. And in total, out of the 855 servers they had in the capsules, they only lost 6 while running. And in a similar comparison experiment where they ran a couple racks on dry land, they only had 135 servers, but they lost 8 out of the 135. And so they think that the constant temperature probably made a big difference versus, having the fluctuations you get from trying to cool a data center, but also the inert nitrogen gas, meaning that oxygen isn't trying to react and corrode stuff all the time. But I also wonder, being under a bunch of water, if those servers were more protected from cosmic rays and things that maybe flip bits and cause random things. Although when they say they lost the server, I don't mean if they actually had component failures or just it had to go offline for one reason or another or crashed and might not have had a good way to try to get the machine back when you need to bring it up from the 120 miles offshore and put some oxygen in it before someone can go inside and see what happened.
I strongly suspect just not having humans wandering around also probably played a role because, technician error is definitely one of your more common failure causes for machines in a data center. Mm-hmm. It can be as simple as just somebody accidentally slamming their hip into a rack as they walk by. And, one time might not matter, but the 5th time or the 10th time, you have an issue. Which that also brings us into something interesting. One potential avenue for attack or for, a worse failure outcome with these underwater data centers that Microsoft discovered was the possibility that acoustic issues might get amplified by the fact that, your 40-foot tube is literally underwater. And if you've ever done any diving, you realize that particularly lower frequencies travel a long way and generate a lot of volume underwater. And if you need an example of why that can be a problem, we're going to have Joe put a link to a YouTube clip of Brendan Gregg screaming at servers in a data center, and you watch the latency go up as the hard drives have issues with the vibration of him literally just at a bunch of servers.
Yeah, it turned out what they actually discovered as the root cause of that problem when that was Brendan Gregg and Brian Cantrell was the city bus pulling away from the curb outside of the office on a fairly regular schedule. When they built this metric system that Sun was made famous for, they would see these spikes in latency fairly regularly, but not like computer regularly, right? It wasn't exactly every 15 minutes or something, but it was on a regular basis, but always a bit sloppy. And they're like, it can't be something with a computer. Computers aren't sloppy. And eventually they figured out it was the diesel engine of the city bus pulling away from the stop in front of the office on a somewhat regular but not precise schedule, that those vibrations were causing the latency spike in the hard drives.
Backdoor slipped into multiple WordPress plugins in ongoing supply chain attack.
In one sense, it's really not news because this has been going on for as long as WordPress has been around. If you're not careful when you shop for themes and or plugins, particularly free versions of either, you can very easily wind up causing your WordPress site to be very exploitable and vulnerable to compromise. And this particular attack chain just seems to be a bad actor who's done exactly that. They've compromised several plugins, none of them particularly popular. The most popular of the lot had, I think, 30,000 downloads, which is not a whole lot for WordPress plugins. And the upshot is if you install one of these compromised plugins, then somebody else gets the ability to post nasty SEO crap on your WordPress to try to advertise nonsense or distribute malware. You generally are probably not going to see it yourself because they tune these things so that the results will show up on search engines and unlogged in visitors. But they generally don't want it to show up if somebody is logged in viewing the site because that's probably going to be the admin. And if the admin sees it, the admin might fix it. So in one sense, this isn't news. It's literally the same thing that's been going on for 20 years straight. In another sense, it's news because, hey, it's a new attacker doing the same old thing with a new bunch of plugins.
Well, in particular, I think this one I can see in the article, they kind of try to relate it to the XZ utils code library thing from a little while ago. This one is obviously far less sophisticated. It mostly seems somebody managed to compromise the account of the developer who posted the legitimate plugin and add some heavily obfuscated malware into the plugin. In the field, I've seen this kind of thing happen, like Jim said, for 10 years now. Oftentimes, they're just redirecting people to a different site in order to steal traffic, or they're trying to install malware, or doing a pop-up, or doing something to try to make money off of the traffic that is going to your website.
The short version is, if you're worried about this, well, look over your WordPress. Did you install a whole bunch of random plugins that you found? You might want to figure out which one of those you're actually using and which ones you can do away with and pare that attack surface down. A default WordPress install, contrary to the popular meme, is actually a very hardened and very secure platform. It becomes vulnerable to compromise the more that you monkey around with it without knowing what you're doing. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of developers out there that are pushing themes and plugins alike, and those developers don't know what they're doing. And if you install those themes and plugins, you will create avenues to compromise your site. Now, in this particular case, we're looking at plugins which were specifically compromised already, and there's an avenue of attack very deliberately placed in the plugin, although not by the original developer. But if you're listening to this as somebody who admins your own WordPress site, that part really doesn't even matter because the repositories for these plugins and themes are so littered with exploitable themes and plugins, and there are so many motivated attackers out there that will find these vulnerabilities and exploit them that really you need to be practicing better hygiene to begin with and not just saying, well, I want to avoid these 4 compromised plugins, but I want to avoid as many plugins and themes and extra bits and bobs as I possibly can because that's how they get you.
Yeah, and you want to focus on plugins and so on that are actively maintained, right? You don't want one where, the person who made this hasn't touched it in a couple of years and they reused the password on some other site and that password got leaked and now an attacker is logged into their WordPress account and is posting updates to this plugin suddenly.
And you also want to make sure you've got automatic updates enabled for both WordPress and your plugins.
Automatic updates are almost always a good idea. We are aware that it has been a meme for a very long time. Oh, I'm the one who controls the frequency of my updates, and that will keep me safe because if there's a bad update, I simply won't apply it. But in reality, that's not how those odds break down. If you're not applying automatic updates, what that really means is you have a longer vulnerability window before you resolve any vulnerabilities that have made their way into your stack, and therefore you are more likely to get compromised. So apply those updates, folks. Do it automatically. Do it often.
Indeed. We especially saw that recently with the OpenSSH vulnerabilities. It's like, you don't want to be screwing around with that one. Get that shit installed.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures, Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud, and ask the hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Coding error in forgotten API blamed for massive data breach.
Yep, this one is another common lesson that people need to learn. So the Australian telco, Optus, had basically two different versions of their API, and they found a flaw, but only fixed it in one of them. So the data breach happened and got about 9 million customers' personal information exposed, and they blamed it on, this programming mistake in their API. So basically, they had two URLs you could use to get to this API, www.optus.com.au and api.optus.com.au, described as the main domain and the target domain. Retrieving info that uses the API was meant to be using the target domain. And the whole point was to get all of that automated traffic away from their website that has static content and is on the main domain. They migrated the API to the target domain back in 2017. The target APIs were secured by various access controls designed to prevent unauthorized access, which sounds suspicious to me, but anyway. But back in 2018, a coding error broke one of those access control methods and meant it didn't work on either the target or the main domain. But Optus spotted this error in 2021. So the data was exposed and accessible to anybody from 2018 to 2021, and then they fixed it, and they don't think anybody stole it in that time. But when they fixed it, they only fixed it on the main domain, possibly because whoever fixed it didn't know that there was a second copy of the same software running on a different domain that was different but the same. But it meant the target domain remained online, internet-facing, but without the authentication fix. And it was not decommissioned despite the lack of any need for it. So they gave up on trying to get everybody to change their API URL to be API. Instead of www. And then they left the old one just laying around unpatched for years. Then in September of 2022, an attacker was able to bypass the access control and send requests to this target API and download the information of 9.5 million people. And this sent Optus and its Singaporean owner, Singtel, into a world of pain.
My favorite part of this whole thing is, part of the filing from the court itself going after Optus reads, the cyber attack was not highly sophisticated or one that required advanced skills or proprietary internal knowledge of Optus processes or systems. It was carried out through a simple process of trial and error, which is definitely not the thing you want to hear a court of law saying about your InfoSec practices.
Yeah, so it sounds like there basically was just no authentication on this API. They quoted as specifically saying, various access controls designed to prevent unauthorized access. That is the wrong way around to do it. You want controls that say only authorized access, nothing else. Not, we're going to try to block most types of unauthorized access, right? You want to enumerate what's allowed and not try to enumerate badness, because there's always more badness than you can think of. You can't just block everything you can think of and think you'll be secure. You want to only allow what's absolutely necessary and nothing else.
This is why your firewall policies are all supposed to be default deny. If you didn't create a rule allowing it through, it should be blocked. It's the same thing here. A big part of the moral of this story is you have to keep track of your technical debt. You've got to pay it off. You've got to clean up your cruft. If you've got two different ways of getting to the same data on the back end, you probably should be looking at ways to get rid of one of those ways and have everything go down the one channel, because otherwise you wind up with these forgotten pathways into something like what we're looking at here. And, this isn't even something that's new to computers. I mean, this kind of issue, we forgot about the back way in, has been a problem for thousands of years. I mean, you look at stories of like hilltop fortresses getting raided because somebody forgot about a goat trail that went around the back, and somebody got in through the goat trail and then let the main gate open. We're kind of looking at the same thing here. Somebody left, this, I want to say unused, except it kind of wasn't because they gave up on getting people not to use it, but this uncared for, unmaintained API, they leave it lying around. They're just like, it's there, whatever, it's fine. And they forget about it. And next thing you know, one of the Pavan Hillmen has dropped off the goat trail into the back of your camp and you're in a world of hurt.
It's a bit like having a ton of WordPress plugins installed that you've forgotten about and you don't need anymore.
Or it's like trying to run a dual stack network with both IPv4 and IPv6, and unfortunately, you cannot create a single firewall to manage access to that. You've got to duplicate all of your rules for the IPv4 stack onto the IPv6 stack, if in some cases slightly modified in the ways that IPv6 is different, but still, like if you let through HTTP on one side, you've got to do on the other, HTTPS on one side, you got to do the other. So you have to do all this duplication. And it makes the odds so much higher that you're going to screw something up, and you're either not going to let something through that you should on one side or the other, or you're going to let something in that you shouldn't on one side or the other, because you have to do all this weird duplication work. And there's, as of yet, still nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has written some kind of an abstraction layer to just like automatically build this for you out of a single holistic firewall rule set. I wish, but it's not there yet.
Microsoft hit snooze again on security certificate renewal. They didn't have monitoring for their SSL cert.
Yeah, this happens to Microsoft a lot. And it's like, how have they not centralized this yet? Well, yeah, they forgot to renew the certificate for cdn.uci.officeapps.live.com. And this meant that a bunch of people's machines were saying, I can't make a secure connection to Office, and literally disabled the Office apps for a whole bunch of businesses because the certificate expired.
My first instinct was, why don't they just use Let's Encrypt? That's all automated, and you don't really have to worry about renewing it. You just have to worry about monitoring it.
Well, they're not doing that because they're Microsoft, and they are inevitably going to view Let's Encrypt as like a cheaper, lesser than, and they don't want to, tarnish their brand with a thing that anybody can do for free. But probably the better question is, why haven't they just built out their own internal equivalent? I mean, it's Microsoft. If they don't want to use Let's Encrypt, they could build out their own completely automated tool set to renew these certificates. And in fact, they may have. The one thing we can be certain that they didn't do is set up monitoring that they actually pay attention to on these things. Because if they'd done that, then somebody's phone would have been blown up in their pocket for a week straight, warning that this certificate was about to expire and somebody needed to do something about it.
I'm lazy, so mine starts warning me a month ahead of time because I know I'll keep putting it off. And in this case, with Let's Encrypt, it means, well, if it's down to 30 days and it hasn't renewed, something's broken and I got to go fix it before somebody notices. What's interesting here is these certificates were actually issued by Microsoft. So while Microsoft's not a certificate authority, they got basically a subordinate CA from a certificate authority. So they can issue their own certificates, which means they can do their own Let's Encrypt-like thing and that they can do it for up to a year. They don't have to use the short time that Let's Encrypt does on purpose, because Let's Encrypt wanted to make sure everybody automated it and didn't depend on just manually running the Acme client or whatever once a year to renew the certificate. And to make sure that because it's tied to the control of the domain, they wanted to keep the short so you couldn't end up with a certificate, then let the domain expire and somebody else picks it up and you still have a certificate for that domain. So what makes all this worse is because Microsoft issued the certificate, on the certificate authority that they run, they can just get a list of every certificate they've issued and when it expires. They don't have to manually add monitoring for each of these hosts or something. They can just, as the certificate issuer, have a list of every certificate they've issued and know when they expire and be like, this one's about to expire. Are we sure we're not using it somewhere?
This is, of course, far from the first time Microsoft has done this. They recently, in 2022, forgot to renew the certificate for the web page of the Windows Insider subdomain. So all the folks that were enrolled in their free testing program got treated to certificate errors. That wasn't their first either. This is kind of a perennial oops for Microsoft, and it's odd that they haven't put something in place to stop stepping on their own feet this way. The register being the register, they had a pretty interesting twist on the end of it, just to kind of stick the knife in and dig around a little bit. They asked Microsoft Copilot what to do about certificate expiration problems. Copilot suggested monitoring expiration dates and renewing certificates before they expire, and went on to say, remember, expired certificates can lead to service outages and unencrypted connections, affecting your organization's reputation and customer relationships. Stay vigilant and keep those certificates up to date. Now, longtime listeners will know none of us subscribe to the belief that AI is intelligent at all, let alone hyper-intelligent, or that it's going to take any of our jobs. But that didn't stop it from being smarter than Microsoft this time around.
Well, it knew the common advice that we give out all the time, and Microsoft just couldn't follow it. Although the registrar also notes an interesting tidbit here. It's actually that subordinate CA that is also expiring. So DigiCert issued Microsoft the Azure ECC TLS issuing certificate number 01, and that was also expiring. So it wasn't just the cdn.uci.officeapps.live.com that was expiring, but the subordinate CA that Microsoft issued it from, the whole CA was expiring. So that means every certificate issued by that CA was also probably expired.
None of that really matters because, again, the ultimate failure is nobody was monitoring this crap. This is not about, a thing that broke that is like really, really, really difficult to fix. This is an issue of we're sleeping at the wheel here. It doesn't much matter if it's just a certificate that expired or if it's your whole CA that expired or if the, machine housing the CA caught on fire or whatever. The point is when these certificates start approaching their expiration dates and a new one hasn't been issued yet, people's phones should be blowing up in their pocket. And, this being Microsoft, it's not just people's phones blowing up in their pocket. I have no doubt there are 65, 85-inch, kiosk screens on walls with, status reports of critical infrastructure. And those things all should have had like big, nasty, flashing red, why do we only have, 30 days or 7 days or whatever until these certificates expire? This is a problem. Somebody needs to deal with it. And putting together an URL and a certificate that literally hundreds of millions of people rely on and then not monitoring it? I don't really even have any words for that, honestly.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Peter has done. He writes, I'm looking for advice on configuring Linux workstations for remote access. When working remotely, developers at our workplace VPN into the corporate network and connect to security-hardened physical Linux workstations. Some of them get by using SSH or VS Code with the SSH remote extension, but others require remote desktop access. My experience so far is that VNC just isn't going to cut it. So the first question is, how can we achieve the best possible user experience for remoting into desktop Linux, preferably on GNOME with Wayland? The second question is, how can I help the developers to reuse their desktop session when they arrive at work physically? Ideally, they would disconnect from their remote session with their desktop apps running, and when they unlock their workstation after coming in, they would find all their apps running just as they left them the day before.
So what you're looking for here is something called NoMachine. NoMachine is the proprietary version of what started out as basically a Unix-like only remote control protocol. You could use it on Linux or FreeBSD for a very long time now. There are free versions also called FreeNX and then X2Go. But I think if you want to do Wayland, you may want to spring for the proprietary version, NoMachine, which will definitely connect directly to Wayland, even without need for an X-Wayland wrapper. It's basically going to answer all your issues. In my use of it, I have found FreeNX, which is the NoMachine client and server that I've used. I found it to be just as performant and low latency as Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol, which frankly, I have found to be the gold standard as far as remote desktop applications go. The other thing is, you mentioned you want your developers to be able to just pick up immediately with their disconnected session. And again, FreeNX, NoMachine, whichever you pick, is going to be ideal for that. One of the really nice things about it is, unlike RDP, it does just give you control of the running desktop session. It doesn't lock the existing user out. I've actually used FreeNX on Windows machines before for that, because I had one client who needed to do they had a mapping application that needed 3D hardware acceleration. And the mapping application ran appallingly slowly whenever he would RDP into the server that was running it, and he couldn't figure out why. Well, I took a look at it, and it turns out it's because Microsoft's RDP actually uses a virtual graphics adapter whenever somebody connects. And when it did that, the application that the user was trying to run would detect that virtual graphics adapter, think that was its only potential source of hardware acceleration. And so the whole thing would just be running on software, and it would, be a seconds for frame kind of situation. So I switched that user over to FreeNX, which does not install any kind of a fake graphics adapter, and which does not lock, desktop users out from seeing what's going on with the remote control session. It works in that sense much like VNC does. Everybody can see what everybody is doing. and everything just worked swimmingly. So FreeNX, No Machine, whatever, they're all, they use SSH tunnels for transport. So I really like the security model. Like I said, the performance is great. And I think it's going to basically, hit every checkbox you laid out for us.
Yeah, especially knowing that SSH is already the way you're dealing with, VPN and security hardened to get SSH. It means you already have all the mechanisms in place. And especially if you have like 2FA set up for your SSH, it'll get to piggyback on that and mean you get that extra level of protection for this setup. Not really related to your question, but what Jim was just talking about, some of that was kind of the advantage of the Microsoft RDP protocol is that unlike VNC, instead of trying to take a picture of your screen, divide it up in pieces and send it across, RDP is actually trying to hook into the lower levels of the graphics API and say, okay, so there's a window over there, it's this big by this big, and the title is this, and it contains these different controls and text. And so basically, rather than sending you a picture of what the app is doing, it sent the API calls that the app used to draw the window. And that would allow you to draw the same window on your side, but with much lower latency, especially when bandwidth was a lot more constrained 20, 30 years ago. But when it had to get support for things like playing back video, then they had to invent this virtual graphics card and try to do that. And even that was usually pretty choppy. But yeah, it has some drawbacks, but it also has some advantages. But I think in this case, especially now that we have enough bandwidth to stream even your high resolution screen, something like Low Machine makes a lot more sense and doesn't have the same trade-offs that RDP does.
Now, if you discover that you will need the paid-for version of No Machine rather than using FreeNX or X2Go, any of the free stuff, I did go ahead and look at the pricing for you. The enterprise desktop subscription for a single PC is $44.50 per year. If you've got a lot of machines that you need to get set up, then you can get a subscription pack for 10 machines, $244.50 per year. So obviously that breaks down to, not much more than half the cost, about $25 per machine per year. Not so bad. If this is a work environment, that doesn't sound like it's going to break anybody's budget to essentially fix all the problems that you described.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of businesses kind of take this thing slightly further where everybody's actual desktop machine like this is a VM all running in the server room somewhere. And then sometimes they'll have a thin client or something at a bunch of desks. So when people do come into the office, they can connect to their remote machine, but it doesn't have to, they don't sit at their machine. They sit at some other machine that's just doing a local network connection into that same secured machine.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.